think this is everybody we're expecting here in person. I'd like to call the August 8th, 2023 Lake Mills Public Works Board to order. Roll call, please.
Mr. Picard?
Here.
Mr. White?
Here.
Mr. Polachek?
Here.
Mr. Beekle? Ms. Schmager?
Here.
And Mr. Waters previously informed staff that he'd be unavailable this evening.
Okay, next on the agenda is item 3, correction and or approval of the minutes of July 11th, 2023.
I will move approval of the minutes of July 11th, 2023.
Second.
Motion and second to approve the minutes. Unless somebody prefers otherwise, we'll do all those in favor.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion, minutes are approved.
Can I get verification of who made the second?
Greg.
Thank you.
Greg.
Item 4, questions and public comment. I don't see any. Any online? Nope. Yes? No. Moving on then to item 5, director's report.
Schmager? Here.
Oh.
And Mr. Waters previously informed staff that he'd be unavailable this evening.
That's weird. Okay, next on the agenda is item 2, correction and or approval of the minutes of July.
I think it's come through Zoom. Someone just
Oh,
came in and
Did-
maybe missed the computer.
is it- all right. Moving on then, item 5, well,
Somebody has their hand raised.
so is there somebody that would like to speak on the video conference system under questions and public comment? If so, go ahead. So we're not hearing anything in the city building here. All right, if I don't hear anything more in a few more seconds, we'll just move on then.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you now, yes.
Yeah, this is just Tom Beekle letting you know that I joined on. I had trouble getting onto the system.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks for getting on, and it's good we hear your voice. Thank you. Okay, then moving on to item 5, director's report.
At this time, we didn't list anything in particular as far as topics, but if there's any questions, let us know.
All right. Okay, if anybody on the board has any questions? If not, we'll move on. Item 6, the main item here, discussion recommendation on 2024 capital improvement projects. And we have a prepared motion 23-8-1 in our packet, and we have some documents.
Okay, so there's two attachments included in the packet. One was added earlier today, analysis by the city's financial advisor, but the one that was included is the CIP document. This does break it out by each category that the city anticipates having capital projects for, even though, so that you can see how the public works projects fit in conjunction with other projects within the city, the utility, and then the streets projects obviously being under the review of this board. So we are looking at, for 2024, a total of about $5.7 million worth of projects. I think it's around, The majority of that is under the general obligations, which is going to be your general government purposes, so non-utility, your non-revenue backed entities. So we can start. We have the streets foreman as well as the electric utility foreman here tonight to answer questions that you may have specifically. But to kind of run you through it, the main project for 2024 is going to be the reserved amount for a potential Sandy Beach restaurant project. We're out for RFP on that currently. So that we applied some escalators to the 2018 number that we had, and it's estimated at $2.3 million. That obviously gets affected by scope of project, but based on the initial estimate, that's where that is. So that's a significant portion. The special assessment, Brookstone 8, 1.1 million. That was a project that ended up, it was bid this year, but ended up not being awarded due to cost increases, and so at the request of the developer. So the developer will be seeking to rebid that again this year, perhaps as early as getting authorization from the council as early as next week. No changes to the project, just a different year in which is occurring. So that's listed in the CIP. The city does front the costs of that. However, there's a longstanding development agreement with the developer in which the cost of that project is recouped by the city at time of sale of the property. So that's why it's under the category of special assessment. So when the developer or who they assign the land to sells a home, there is a special assessment that you would notice on your closing documents that builder sends to the city. And that is the funding mechanism behind that project. We do not have, beyond the special assessment Brookstone 8 street project, we do not have a street project scheduled in the recommended CIP. That is another Milton Street, I think was 1.2 million dollars in total. That was moved to 2025, so that project was delayed. We do maintain $300,000 in the street maintenance budget, as well as some smaller items like $20,000. We did successfully purchase some land off of CP Avenue, which we anticipate utilizing for a new yard waste drop-off area. That $20,000 would be for just initial fencing or other improvements that might need to get that up and running. We anticipate using some already city-owned material, some millings from previous projects, and street staff to get that set up in order to keep those costs down, to hopefully bring that into operation, a goal of spring of '24. There's several equipment purchases throughout that Dwayne, TJ, or Mark can provide you answers on if there's questions about them. But streets on the general obligation side, $180,000 for a new tandem dump truck. One of the things that we are up against is there are new emissions standards coming out starting in 2025, which is adding significant costs to the purchases of equipment. So if we purchase some of the equipment before that, we're saving I think as much as 25% on the cost of the vehicle. But that piece of equipment is due for replacement. Wastewater and water aren't significant requests in this. The $34,000 total for wastewater and $9,000 total for the water utility, as we still await confirmation on what federal funding there may be available for a wastewater treatment plant. That's not included in this plan, as we simply don't have the information to provide you with an educated estimate of what the cost of that project will be. So with that, if we want to go section by section, if you want to start with the electric utility, and if you have any specific questions of those in there, you do see some funds in 2024 allocated for Milton Street. Ideally, you do the electric improvements the year prior to a street reconstruction. It's the most efficient way for the electric utility to complete their work there, so that's why that's included there. It doesn't always work out that way. Oftentimes we're doing them in tandem, but with the delay, it provides an opportunity to be able to complete that work ahead of time. Northern system improvements are for extension and upgrades of services for some of the customers north of the interstate. SCADA, and we can bring TJ up for these. SCADA is a system that we use to monitor our utility, and the digger derrick is a piece of equipment that it was high on the priority of staff's replacement list as it improves their efficiency and is something that we will be hurting without. So specific questions on electric utility, Dwayne or TJ should be able to answer in detail about them.
Greg?
I've got a question on Milton Street. I went out and looked at it. I remember when we did West Lake Street, I think it was 2020, 2021. They did the electric the year before, and then they came through and did the project. Part of that was North Ferry, but most of it I think was Lake. But I remember that after it was all said and done, then We Energies came back with some gas stuff. And so my question really is there any gas work? Is there any coordination with We Energies on Milton Street? So if they have work, they can do it at the same time. So then you should be in the clear for 2025.
That's definitely the goal, always. West Lake Street didn't work out that way, of course. And I know Brandon was online. I think he's still online, but the budget for Milton Street for the design is still in 2023, and the intention is to still move forward with the design of Milton Street, which would then provide TJ with information for the electric utility. When that design occurs, typically that's at the point when Brandon and Strand send those plans to the utilities to let them know that this is the project that the city is undertaking and in which year. Typically, there would be coordination, and that would occur prior to or during the construction. In the case of Lake Street, that didn't happen. Brandon, is there anything else you would want to add to that statement?
Very well summarized, Dwayne, as always. Yes, I think he hit it on the head that Lake Street was a bit unfortunate. The decision making on when to come in there, was a kind of a process, but Milton Street, we would certainly get the plans ahead of time to We Energies. I think doing the design, say this year, and not doing the project until 2025 also gives We Energies plenty of time to kind of plan their work. I will say that oftentimes they intentionally don't do their work until the street is actually like ripped up and kind of under construction, because they like to kind of take advantage of traffic control, road closures, a restoration that's going to happen anyways as part of the road project. So there's a likelihood that they wouldn't come in, say, in 2024 anyways and kind of do their work with the electric utility. They might do it in 2025 anyways. But at least it would give them the opportunity to kind of get it done and be out of the way for the main, road utility contractor. So we'll see what happens, but it's certainly doing the design this year certainly gives us a lot of flexibility with those other utilities.
Do you have a feel if they're going to need to do some gas line work or not?
I don't really. It usually depends on the age or material of the main.
Yep.
The other areas, in the other projects in that area of the city, they have tended to want to replace their mains, kind of getting rid of, older metal mains and replacing with the current plastic material they use. So if I had to bet on it, I would say they might want to do at least some work there, if not replace the whole main. Sometimes what they also like to do these days is even if there is a a suitable main on one side of the road, they'll put another main on the other side of the road because sometimes they like to avoid having gas services that run, 60, 70 feet all the way across the road right away. I think they've sometimes had issues with those getting hit, with other work in the future. So I would say that there's a high likelihood that they would do at least something with the Milton Street project.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about the entire electric utility set of projects. I'm curious what 2023 or historical, actually for every category, because I really don't have a reference on, is 1.269. I think that's what we have for 2024. On the high end, is it typical? What did we spend in 23, or what did we plan in 23, and what is our spend rate against that amount? And so I'm not sure if this is would be considered. I know you have primarily three big ticket items: the northern system improvements, the Digger Derrick, and the Milton Street Electric that are really pulling this up heavy. But what does the history look like for the electric projects and capital typically?
So I'll try to pull some of the data from previous CIPs. Realize that sometimes in the utility, the numbers are a little different in the past, and we're trying to be more encompassing. And as you see this year, unlike other years, we've included both the police department, the parks and grounds, and as well as the fire department, to try and give a bigger picture as we discuss the street projects and the projects with the utilities. So to try and summarize, I did pull up last year's CIP. It was $602,000 for the electric utility. $100,000 was the College Street, and $450,000 was a bucket truck. So that was the bulk of that in 23. In 22, bear with me, I'm pulling that up. That one was $350,000. That one included a bucket truck as well. That then actually didn't get purchased, got purchased in 23. So it basically pulled forward. If I go back to 2021, the electric utility had $200,000, and that was, again, the Lake Street project that we've already discussed. I know that it doesn't match the number that you're looking at this year, and as I go back to 2024, there are two large purchases that are affecting that, and that is the Digger Derrick, as well as that northern system improvement that's required. And again, we're looking at phasing that over a number of years, but it's also to provide the service for existing and some future customers north of the interstate.
Thanks.
Does that help?
That's, yes, very much so. Thank you.
So why is pole testing under capital improvements?
Good question. It's something that could be considered maybe in pole maintenance, but we wanted to talk about that a little bit. We are looking to do more, TJ and I have been talking about doing more pole testing, which will then provide more information for pole attachments and the conditions of the existing overhead pole system throughout the system. What we're showing you here is that we are looking to have an outside consultant or service provider come in and do some of that pole testing at about a 20% a year basis. The concern, and the reason we wanted to bring that to your attention, is as those pole testing are done, if there are some that are red flagged and are deemed to be needed to be replaced, then that hits the maintenance budget, which is a separate budget. But we wanted to bring this to your attention to know that the utility is looking at the condition and the attachments that are being put on the poles. Those attachments are actually a revenue source as well. And so TJ and I have been looking at, with staff, of trying to have a little more concerted effort in that maintenance, similar to what we do with the street maintenance. Really looking at the program from a maintenance side rather than reactive, be proactive and be ahead of ahead of the curve. Does that help explain why that number is in there? One could argue that it probably could be in pole maintenance, but thanks for asking the question. That's exactly why it was there.
And if some things that are listed, I just want to reiterate that as we continue to improve the document, and it'll take a number of years to kind of get it where I'd like to be, it doesn't necessarily show what the funding mechanism for. So while the majority of those listed are anticipated to be either revenue, GO borrowing, GO debt, a local borrow, or a revenue debt, some of these may still have a funding mechanism of cash, i.e. they won't be debt funded. And that is probably likely in the utility. Some of them could be cash funded as well, but they're still listed as a capital expenditure, but it's not that we're incurring debt to fund them. The bigger ones certainly, but some of the smaller ones, we would look for opportunities for something cash within allocating cash into a capital budget to pay for some of them.
Whether it's capital or not is not determined by the funding mechanism, but by the nature of the expenditure, correct?
Correct, if you can amortize it over a number of, however many years. So the pole testing also involves not just, the testing of it, but is wrapped up into replacement as well as attachments onto that pole, so improvements to the pole from other users as well. So, it's something, it gets analyzed by the PSC as well when you submit O&Ms and capital to them. So it certainly probably could go either way, but it was something new as well that we wanted to call out specifically for the board.
Will the pole testing also include checking the poles for decay and how structurally sound they are?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And on Milton Street, with everything going underground, the communications utilities will also go underground?
So it hasn't finalized whether, so the service comes across 89, so it's likely a portion of Milton regardless will remain overhead, because we'll have to analyze the cost of it, but getting the permits in order to go underneath State Highway 89 can take a lot of time and can be costly. So there likely will remain portions of Milton that will remain overhead.
Is
And
that,
so that
is
would
that
be-
for electric as well as communications?
Correct.
Okay.
And then there are obviously services that remain overhead on Milton Street. I believe there are 2 homes. If there are, then there still would be the need for poles and some, overhead capacity, but that would be part of when it gets designed, and then the input from the electric utility and analysis of cost benefit of burying versus remaining overhead would be more fleshed out after we've completed the design of the roadway. But I just don't want to give the impression that 100% of all of the power lines will be underground, as that may not be the case.
So for telephone and cable, does the electric make the decision and those utilities follow suit, or do they have some input?
They have a right, but that's a good question.
So we're required to provide notice. And then at that point, they have a certain amount of time per rules to either move with us underground or purchase the poles. TJ, am I
Okay,
explaining that correctly?
all right.
So they're entitled to be in the space, but they may bear additional costs if they don't choose to follow us.
Right, they will become the owners and have that responsibility, which I'm sure they're not keen on. Okay,
So like the gas company, those utilities will be contacted as the design moves forward with whatever plan the electric utility proceeds with, and then we'll notify those customers that are attached to those poles.
anybody else have any questions on electric? Let's move on to the next section then, which is not fire, I assume.
We can,
It's,
I guess, you know,
Grounds?
you can, if you have questions about others that are listed, you're welcome to answer them within the, I guess, the review scope of the Public Works Board. The next one would be, the special assessment is, Brookstone Phase 8, so the Brookstone subdivision that gets, built out. You'll recall that earlier, when was that bid?
March, correct,
And-
Brandon?
Earlier this year, it was bid. The city did receive bids, but it was 37% increase per lot based on what the developer had been used to seeing. And so the developer requested that the city not move forward and delay. So we're working on putting that bid back together and providing a longer time frame for the contractors to complete the work, to hopefully get some lower pricing that the developer is more comfortable with. This is part of a development agreement that was executed by the city between the developer and the city. So it has been a long-standing partnership for the build-out of the subdivision, but this is for construction of infrastructure, and so roadways, utilities, and it would result in, I believe, 18 additional buildable lots.
go ahead.
I had a question, really, I know you skipped over to,
Mike,
I know you, Drake, I know you skipped over to special assessment, but I had a question about the fire department. Sometimes that doesn't always come to us. But is there any equipment that they need to additional, that they may not already have for fighting fires for electrical cars and some of the batteries? Some of the fire departments have been upgrading their equipment because of the increased sales and usage of electrical vehicles, and I was just wondering if there's any
Sure.
need there for that.
So Chief Russ is on week 2, so he has dived into the financials and has provided initial feedback on it. But he'll be doing a more in-depth analysis, but it's not something that he's brought up that's immediate right now. We did just, in the current, a mixture of operating and capital dollars for this year, we did purchase new turnout gear and PPE and whatnot in this year's budget. There will be some analysis of the equipment of the fire department, years of life remaining, which pieces of apparatus should be maintained in the fleet, or which could be retired and not replaced, but replacing a different one to take over the use that it was for. So we don't have anything planned for the fire department for next year, but we do anticipate this one being in the out years on this one, perhaps changing, you know, when you might see it next year, and kind of scheduling what that will look like. But Chief Russ will perform a more in-depth analysis of the operating and capital budgets of that department for future consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on the Brookstone?
No, but before we skip over, I know we're jumping to,
I'd like to talk about Brookstone since we're
oh,
talking
sure,
about.
if we're on Brickstone, stay there. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So I know in the more distant past, the city did not work the way the city is currently working with Brookstone in terms of construction and financing. And I understand part of the reason, correct me if I'm wrong, part of the reason for that was because of the way the state structured city budgets and restricted increases even to the not even allowing cost of living adjustments to city budgets. I understand that the state has passed some pretty significant changes to budgets for cities. So in light of that, does that change the thought process for working with developers this way versus the previous method of more hands-off?
Sure. There's a few different parts of that question. So,
It's a big question.
yep, Brookstone will continue in this vein because of that development agreement.
Yep.
I think that the impetus for it perhaps was to encourage and continue the construction of single-family homes in the city, that this was a way of alleviating some risk from the developer to ensure that that construction continued. That is what I would assume. I think it was almost 20 years ago that the process started. And so that would be what I would assume was part of that intent, was to assist in continuing seeing single-family homes developed. As far as the state changes, the way that the city raises revenue has not changed. So there's a few different ways that the state limits how the city brings in revenue, and then also how the state attempts to compensate the city, I guess, for that loss of local control. So the first piece is levy limits. So the state sets what's called a levy limit on the city, basically a control on how much the city can increase its property tax levy. That is our main source of revenue to fund operations of the city. And so that is, you are allowed to increase your levy 0%, with the exception that you can increase it by what's called net new construction. So the percentage of new stuff that gets built in the community. So new homes that get built, new businesses that get built, renovations, replacements, things like that goes into that net new construction. There's a worksheet that the state sends to the city. You fill it out, it kicks out a percentage, and that percentage is what you can raise your levy by.
And that doesn't include cost of living. And it does
Correct.
not include just, oh, houses cost more to build now, so your house is worth more. It doesn't even count that, correct?
No, it only takes into effect the new stuff that was built. So if nothing got built in Lake Mills, the budget would be 0%.
The budget increase would be
The budget increase would be 0%.
on the levy.
That is not changing. That has not changed with the changes in state law. What they have focused on changing is how state aid is allocated to communities. So, for example, this is off the top of my head, so I won't remember the exact numbers, but let's say 20 years ago, 2000, we were receiving somewhere around $430,000, let's say. Recently, for many, many years, the city has been at $335,000. So there were reductions in what the state aid that was coming to the city, and it remained flat. It simply was not increasing. So the state is allocating additional dollars to local governments in the state aid budget. I cannot remember exactly what our allocation will be, but it will be higher than we've seen in the past. And in future years going forward, after this biennium passes, they have tied the increases in state aid to the increases in revenue that the state receives through the sales tax. So essentially, it's supposed to be that the success of the state, part of that success comes back to the city, comes back to the cities, villages, towns, counties. So it's like 1% of the state sales tax, if I remember correctly, is dedicated to that state aid. So a portion of that is to help local governments. Now, how that affects capital, the city council could decide to cash fund purchases that perhaps it hasn't been in the past, and not borrow for some. So that's on the funding mechanism of it. I anticipate that the operational needs of the city are going to continue to rise because of the things you mentioned: cost of living increases, cost of health insurance going up, contractual increases that come into play. So the cost of just doing what we have always done, what we are currently doing, gets more expensive every year. So we have been finding cost-saving measures or not, funding things or doing less or doing more with less, things of that nature. So the influx of dollars from the state should help us to perhaps remedy some of the deficiencies in our budget that we've been feeling for years. Will it affect how the city interacts with developers and that relationship? At this point, I don't think it'll play too much into that. Now, the city could obviously, after phase 8, there's only one more phase of Brookstone. So whether the city ever chooses to enter into another development agreement of this nature with a developer in the future, I can't say right now. Brookstone has been successful, and the city has not seen adverse effects of the development agreement, but it is a interplay between where the risk falls at a certain amount of time on the development. So that is a consideration the city has to make if it were to do it in the future. But we're nearing the end of that Brookstone, those phased plans for the Brookstone development. What development looks like after that, time will, I guess, tell us. That was a long answer there.
So most of the city's revenue is from the levy, some is from state aid. Approximately what percentage of the state is state aid compared to the total budget? Because that state aid revenue now will be different in that it is more or less indexed to the cost of living.
Mm-hmm. Sam, do you have offhand what percentage of our revenue is municipal aid from the state?
Not off the top of my head, but I can take a minute and try to find out, calculate it.
It's pretty low, like 10% or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be because, $335,000 is what the municipal state aid. Now we get transportation aids, computer aids, and other things. So it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but in the scope of our entire budget, it's not going to be.
Which is in the millions, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's not 50% of our budget,
Right.
for example.
Okay, thank you. That's all. Just rough idea. Anything else on Milton Street or the bigger question? No. Then, if not, then Mary, you had something else?
Yeah, I actually have a question, but maybe it'll be answered when we continue through the departments, and I'll just hold my thought until I have you walk through everything else.
I wanted to go back up to grounds and facility.
Well,
Sure.
that's where my question was, but it might be covered somewhere.
Yeah,
else.
I thought maybe Drake had skipped over that already.
We can touch on it. I was just skipping towards the ones that are traditionally reviewed by
All right.
Public Works. We
Yeah.
wanted to give the board a more comprehensive view of what it looks like and how they interact with each other. It's just that by ordinance, the recommendation that the Public Works Board makes is on the specific sections within the purview, but questions about them, I'm more than happy to answer.
Well, that section includes what's in the motion.
Yeah,
Ah,
yeah, that, which was my question, but I thought perhaps it was going to get picked up when we got to the
Sure.
street department or some other area.
nope. I think we
lot
can hit on those
specifically.
questions now, if you'd like.
Yes, I think, Greg, you have some questions?
Well, I
too?
do. On the parking lot at Sandy Beach and also the restaurant, I have a question.
Sure.
Do you?
Nope, go right ahead.
Okay, so my question on the restaurant is that 2.3 million, is that a proposal that's an actual bid that came in?
No, it's based off of, I believe, the concept study that the city completed back in 2018.
Okay, so is that just a placeholder then?
It's not reflective of any real numbers that we have from bids or restaurant tours or anything like that. So that number could certainly change, yes.
Seems a little light for a construction of a restaurant, but that's a different matter. That's why I wondered where that came from. My other question is on the parking lot, same question really, is that a placeholder, the 1.3? And
Well,
is
it's a
that,
total of
do you know what
2.6.
square footage that accounts for?
So on the building or the parking lot.
Parking lot.
So let me see if I can give a summary of what some of our thinking was with these numbers. So each of these numbers was, as Drake mentioned, the 2018 report by Mead & Hunt was supplemented with some work from Strand on some estimates in 2018, not only for the restaurant, but also for the parking lot. The restaurant, while still in RFP mode, correct, could be changed in scope and size yet. So what Drake and I did with that number is we took 2018, currently it stands at about a 5% increase every year since 2018 from the number that was in the report. One could argue that you could also probably have something higher because inflation has been higher than that. But because the scope was unknown as far as size, we just decided to stay with 5% at this point. And so that number was also used for the parking lots in both 25 and 26, the 1.3 million. Same methodology. We used the 2018 Mead & Hunt study and then added 5% per year since. A little bit more maybe to help understand where we were thinking with this. It's in RFP right now. If design happens in late 23, we get through the RFP, the construction potentially could occur if approved in 24. Some of the thinking we had then with 25 is if the restaurant is being constructed and potentially, I mean, there's no end date of if it gets approved, but assume that it would be built so that it would open in 25 early in spring. Potentially 25 parking lot could be built in the winter/early spring, do the final paving on the parking lot in May, but it would actually occur in 25. And so some of the thinking there is that the parking lot and the restaurant end at the same time, even though they're in 2 different years in the budget, in the CIP budget. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And then because of trying to spread the dollars across and make it more evenly, we split the parking lot like it is in the report in 2 different pieces, west and east, and then also added, as you'll notice when we get to the sanitary sewer system, the lift station in Sandy Beach is on the eastern portion of the parking lot, which would happen in 26.
Okay.
Does that help kind of summarize some of your questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I did want to include the grounds and facilities work in it because the Sandy Beach redevelopment, the restaurant, the parking lots, those are considerable costs to the city. And so they do affect, the ability to do other projects, which is, one of the reasons why in here Milton Street is in 2025, because as you start adding all those dollars, those general obligation dollars in, it starts to perhaps get to a point where the city's uncomfortable with where it is with its debt capacity. Well, you can touch on some analysis Ellers did for us on that after we make it through this document. And it just increases the costs and the amount of dollars that we're taking on at any given time. So when we're talking about a $2 million restaurant and a $1.3 million parking lot and another $1.3 million parking lot and a $1.1 million road project, there's needs in the community. There's a lot of priorities that need to be set. So that's where you start seeing some of the, stretching out those projects over a number of years in order to smooth out the impacts of those projects.
So where in the timetable does the improved infrastructure, like the timing of when and I don't know if maybe that's what I'm not sure what the MHC West and East Loop, but I think the entire, I could tell you that the 2.7 mil all in on a parking lot caught me by surprise. I've seen the plans that were pulled together and I saw the parking lot looks very, very, very large. I'm not sure what the rationale now was for such a really large surface. But having the $2.7 million price tag along with the 2.3 in the restaurant, and you start adding it all together now, the numbers are starting to come along with what was the plan from 18. I'd be curious to see whether that parking lot is really still desired. Getting back to your point about if you built a parking lot that was only, I'm making this up, 1.5 million, how big would it be? What compromises would that take? Because I feel that, like, that one just in particular caught my attention, was the rationale for the size and the, and is
Yeah,
it, you know,
some of the rationale would be, it was contemplated that the restaurant would become a year-round facility. The popularity of Sandy Beach has continued to increase over the years. And another consideration is that the city receives a considerable amount of revenue to its operating dollars, the Grounds and Facilities Department specifically, from the lease payments of the Sandy Beach Trailer Park. When the city needs to redo the infrastructure under the Sandy Beach Trailer Park, that lease revenue, or at least portions of it, will disappear. And so in order to fill that revenue gap, there had been discussions in that 2018 time of charging for parking and creating a parking utility or something like that. So instead of charging to enter Sandy Beach, you would charge to park, with the understanding that residents could walk to Sandy Beach. You know, those were all things that were considered. And so there is a question of when the city is not receiving that lease revenue, what fills that gap in the budget? And one of the options of that is revenue from parking.
When you say not receives that lease revenue, is that a reduction due to reconfiguration, or is that elimination?
We won't collect anything while it's under construction, so it's a complete loss of that, and there will be likely loss of some lots because bringing it up to modern code and fire safety will reduce the amount of units that are in there.
Yep.
so then the infrastructure, is that in the West Loop and East Loop? So when does the infrastructure, I'm feeling, maybe I'm misunderstanding the infrastructure improvements, that the sewer and everything underneath all of that over in that area needed improvement because it was starting to fail. It was on a very old set of infrastructure.
Correct.
And so where does that fall in the timetable? Because if you have your restaurant and then your parking, I would have thought the infrastructure would have been in before the parking lot. Like, is that anywhere in the next 5-year plan, or is that investment even beyond 28?
So that is the MHC West and East Loop.
Okay,
That's the MHC. What's the acronym that Mead and Hunt used? Mobile Home.
Yeah.
I can't.
don't know what the C is.
I can't come up with the C. So those 27 and 20.
Home community.
Thank you.
Yes.
27 and 28 would be those years. That would be sewer, water, and the site redevelopment.
Okay.
And remember, in the park, that's actually currently private sewer and water. And so the future would be built just like a development to go public sewer and water throughout the development. But as Drake had mentioned, during those years, even if we do look to build during non-traditional times of the year, which we will definitely look to do that to maximize the lease in those years, but there will be probably some interruption with that. And so the dollars on the 1.3 in the parking lot probably are affected, and we can go back into the report and look, but there are provisions for types of parking lot collection devices that may not be as labor intensive, meaning there would be more electronic devices to collect, and that's probably a higher price, and that's probably impacting that 1.3, my recollection of that report. So I hope that helps answer those questions. But 27, 28, I think what we're looking at is restaurant, parking lot west, parking lot east, first portion of the mobile home community, and then the second portion of the mobile home community in successive years.
I think we lost the mouse skull.
Eric, your mic is on, or did you intend?
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so that's the difficulty of bringing the utilities before the parking lot is there is no, to fill that gap in our operational budget, there is no mechanism to do that other than you could backfill it with fund balance. You know, the city council could choose to do that if it did not have the revenue to do it. It could subsidize it from our unreserved fund balance for a period of years, but that lease revenue is baked into our operating budget.
Just to answer the earlier question, the state shared equals 5.783% of our revenue budget.
Yep. It's pretty small. Thanks. Anything else on this Sandy Beach stuff? So the Public Works Board doesn't have response authority for park and parkland.
Not under the ordinances, it doesn't, no.
Don't have the authority
So
for what,
we-
Mark?
Parks and parkland.
No.
So what? So I was surprised to see it on the prepared motion.
That's likely a mistake on my part.
Well, then, that makes it.
Or my part, Drake.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it aligns better with a different committee.
All right. Nothing else then on Sandy Beach then? Okay, Drake, would you like to pick a new section to review?
Police department, you can see
Yeah.
there pretty standard purchases that are going on with the
Yeah.
squad is the main point of that, main portion of that. We talked about the special assessments. Now we have the streets department. So 2024 would end up being more of a maintenance year for street work. Obviously, we would have the street project as part of the Brookstone development. That is a street project, an infrastructure project. But as far as existing streets, they have been each delayed 1 year from where they were in last year's CIP. So Milton Street is now 2025. Prospect Street is now 2026, and then Franklin Street is now 2027. So the 300,000 is still our street maintenance budget. We may fall a little bit behind with the $300,000 allocated there. We're kind of coming up on. We're circling back around to the beginning of the street maintenance budget. But if you remember, Dwayne's presentation had an initial, I think, $1 million, $1.3 million initial investment in street maintenance. So we're circling back around to that time period where the streets that were part of that are now coming up again for some work. The $20,000 is a small allocation, as we think that we will be able to utilize the land that was purchased to create a new, more workable yard waste center using some existing city material as well as city staff time to get that set up, and then look into how to improve it in future years over time. The dump truck is a year-round use. It's used for removal of material as well as removal of snow, so it is used year-round. And that is another piece of equipment that will come under the 2025 emissions changes, which would greatly increase the cost of that. And I believe, Mark, did we already order the chassis in a previous budget, or?
We have our name on the chassis.
Okay, so we have reserved.
14 months out, so Lisa International let us put our name on a chassis. So.
Okay, so we've reserved it. There's no we can get out of it if it was not to be included in it, but we have some long lead times on equipment, more so than we're used to in the past. If you have specific questions about how that dump truck is used in operations and how that they use that, Mark can come up to the microphone and answer questions there. Then that brings us through the major parts of the streets department.
Any questions, anyone?
I have a question regarding the values. Are they inclusive of any improvements that we may take on based on the pilot we have on College Street with that new stormwater catching system? That new, so is that, are these inclusive so that if that proves to be, you know, a preferred way to go for stormwater management, that we would have the funding available and ready to go?
Those are the catch basins that are
Yes.
in the inlets. They're not included in the street maintenance budget, but the cost of those it's not overly burdensome. So if we wanted to roll out more of them, we could likely, get a few of them every year. What we're more going to be evaluating is how it impacts staff time and whether we're ever able to get to them to empty them out, and if they're operating how we want them to. So it's more of those costs that we'll be evaluating as well. I think they're only a few $1,000s per catch basin is the wrong word, but the stainless steel insert that goes into the inlet. We would incorporate that into with other equipment purchases that we might make during the year.
Okay.
And in future rebuilds like Milton and East Prospect, would you include those then?
Yeah, and we'll
Assuming,
be evaluating,
assuming they're working out.
right, and evaluating other stormwater techniques. There's been discussions about
Yes.
rain gardens or natural ways to accommodate that. So our engineer Strand is aware that that's a priority for us. So seeking how to incorporate those other things into future street projects as well, particularly with streets that drain into Rock Lake.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just to give a summary, we did reevaluate based on the last 2 years' worth of bids, did increase because of inflation toward really the costs that we're seeing on College Street this year. And then we reapplied that to all of the streets in the capital improvement plan, which obviously jumped that considerably. From that, we also added a 3% inflation after 2023. So if you do go back and look at last year's numbers, they're going to be substantially higher for each of the streets. And then to maybe answer your question, Mary, we do include, not only do we look at the length of the street and some of the infrastructure in detail, we also add a 15% contingency to the number for things like that.
It's
So
something experimental or a problem you might uncover, you anticipate, and
correct.
something, okay.
So we have that in the capital improvement plan, and then as our consultant continues to refine the design in the year, then that is modified in that final plan set. Does that help answer the question of
Yes, thanks.
how that can be absorbed?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Inflation's also hitting street maintenance costs, I imagine, too. So
It is actually good timing. I should have mentioned it maybe earlier, but we do have our contractor coming in tomorrow to let everyone know that tomorrow we will be doing street patching throughout the city. Most of those patches have been excavated already by the street department, and they're ready to go. We've been told that they will first pave in the cemetery tomorrow morning at slightly before, or at 7, and then they'll move throughout the city to fill the patches that were ready for the chip seal program. Prices are already in for this year, right? We approved those budgets or those contracts back in March, April, May. But yes, the 300,000 over time will reduce the amount of streets that we'll be able to do
Great.
as well.
Yeah. Anything else on streets? Looks like wastewater's next.
Yep, so both wastewater and water are not heavy years.
No.
So there's some small equipment purchases that are split amongst departments, like the meter reading equipment and the GIS receiver. In wastewater, we do need another portable generator. So that's the largest. and then some locating equipment for the water utility, and then their portion of the meter reading equipment. So these are on the lighter end of the plan that we've been working through. Obviously, the wastewater treatment plant is not included in this. That is a large project. We simply just don't have enough information yet to know if additional revenue is available to the city, or if I guess which way on the fork of the road we'll end up going.
Any questions?
And then I guess you're all aware, the utilities operate off of on a revenue basis. So the funding for the utilities is backed by ratepayers. The funding for general government, general obligation debt is backed by the full faith and credit of the city, so the city's taxing authority. So they are different funding mechanisms. And a little bit unique, and have some unique traits to them. But that's why we separate out, why you see the utilities separated out specifically. Electric, wastewater, and water all have their own rate structures and their own responsibilities to manage their expenditures absent taxpayer support. If you'd like, I can touch on the analysis by Ehlers. So Ehlers is the city's financial advisor. I sent the updated CIP to them late last week, and then they got back to me very quickly, which I appreciated. But what you'll see in Table 1 is kind of a breakdown of the projects that would be allocated to GO bonds and revenue bonds. Now, their analysis is assuming bonding for projects. That gets determined by the city council as far as a funding mechanism. We do use bonds, we use local borrows. At times, the fund balance has been used to fund projects. So this is assuming the use of bonds, but it's still a useful exercise. So Table 2 is if the CIP was financed, it's going to show you the tax impact, so the debt levy impact. The box in blue, and I apologize for the small numbers here, but the box in blue would be existing debt, as if what it would be if we didn't add any additional debt to it, if we didn't have more projects. On the far right, you can see what the annual taxes on a $350,000 home. That would be what is going towards the debt levy. And then if you go then all the way to the right in the orange, you'll see the difference as we add on debt from the CIP onto the existing debt, what that adds, how that adds up over time. And then obviously we only have projects scheduled through 2028, so in 2029 you start seeing the decline. The next one is another unique aspect of municipal finances, and that's debt capacity. So this is only going to look at the GO bonds. So the general obligation debt of the city, it's actually set by the state constitution, and that you can only have a certain percentage of your equalized value in debt. And so what you can see there is in the orange box on the right, it's bolded percentage of debt limit. In 2023, we're standing at 46%. Through the CIP, you see that start to climb, peaking in 2028 at 66%, and then continuously dropping, obviously, as there aren't currently projects scheduled in those out years. The debt levy of the city is outside of the operating levy, and so that does not have the same restrictions set onto it by state law as it is a constitutional entitlement of the city. And so that the city is allowed to tax to service its debt and to fund its borrowing, which is why there is more flexibility on the debt side of funding things than there is on the operating side of funding things. It's perhaps an unintended consequence of levy limit legislation in that it has pushed communities to fund things through debt that it perhaps may have cash funded in the past, because of that flexibility that it offers to municipalities and that there is more local control over that.
But the payment of the debt payments come out of the general obligations, which is levy limited by the state, right?
No, debt service is, the debt service is not restricted by the levy limits. So the debt levy is outside of that. So that is not calculated when you're calculating your levy, what you're allowed to levy. So your debt service, to pay that debt, to pay the principal and interest, is only controlled. You can raise that levy up until your constitutionally imposed limit.
So if the city wants to borrow X dollars, they can increase the levy by an amount proportional to pay off for that debt.
Correct.
Interesting.
That's correct.
So it's like a hole or a workaround or a.
Right. Well, since it's.
I know it's constitutional
right,
versus.
Since it's in the Constitution,
Yeah.
the state can't limit your ability to. If they did, then it'd be limiting your ability to borrow, which is not permitted. So that's why I say it has pushed perhaps some municipalities in the state to fund things through the debt levy that they may have funded through operational. For example, you could envision for smaller vehicle purchases, maybe you would save $20,000 a year, buy one every 5 years. But for smaller communities that don't, certainly ones that aren't growing, you can see how, for example, when I was in New Glarus, $20,000 a year was a significant amount of money in the operating budget that needed to be used for other purposes. And so non-growing communities, it affects more so than growing communities.
Any other questions?
So Ellers would typically recommend that you stay, at or below the 75% of your debt capacity limit in order to have some capacity for emergency situations that may arise or unintended expenditures that become absolutely necessary. So we are 66%. We start to maybe approach that, but we still have a healthy amount of debt capacity remaining. That it wouldn't necessarily be a concern as far as the debt capacity. Whether the debt levy becomes a concern is a question for policymakers.
Well, if you fund things with debt and you increase your debt limit towards that 75% or whatever, that means you can't do that in the future. So it's that's another consideration. It's
You
not
have to
just
pay it down before you can use it again.
right, and paying it down. Well, that's not that. So yeah, to pay it down, you have to raise property taxes.
Well, debt comes off as debt comes on. So
Right,
we have
right.
older debt that falls off that,
Right.
leaves up some capacity. Bonds especially, it's not like a loan, right? Bonds become callable, but you can't necessarily just pay them off, as you want to. There's times where they're callable that you can take them off the books earlier, but essentially they're a 20-year general obligation bond. That's what it's amortized over.
If interest rates go lower, though, can't you, after a certain number of years, you can refinance them?
Sure.
Right.
There's strategies related to debt that we are pretty much constantly.
Yes.
Sam and I are constantly being advised by Ellers is our principal debt advisor, and how to whether to call, whether to pay things off early.
Right.
because we have local borrows as well, which have no, we don't have prepayment penalties on loans that we would get on from local borrows. We would typically request that there not be prepayment penalties. And so there are options to more aggressively pay down debt sometimes. But you're correct, the funding has to come from somewhere.
All right. If, any other questions? If not, then we should probably move towards a motion. We have a prepared motion, what's the number, 23-8-1, but perhaps make a correction about the Sandy Beach Restaurant and parking lot.
So if you were to make a motion, you could just specify to strike that section up.
Yep.
Well, I'll make the motion to recommend approval of the 2024 capital improvement plans for the street department, light and water utility, wastewater utility, striking Sandy Beach Restaurant and parking lot. To the city council and authorizing the president of the Public Works Board to sign the motion.
Anybody want to make a second?
I'll second that.
Okay. Misty Gregg seconded that. Your mic was off.
Pardon?
Your mic.
Mic's off. There we go.
I'll second that motion.
All right, now she heard it for sure. Okay, motion and second to approve the capital projects per the motion, prepared motion, with striking the Sandy Beach Restaurant and parking lot. Any further discussion? If not, roll call, please, Misty.
Mr. White,
Wait.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually, before that closes, I'm just questioning, by striking it off of the 2024, does that mean it slides, or is it just?
It just means that this committee is not recommending it because it's outside the purview of the scope. It will
So
still
we're
be
approving
included.
striking that from the approval, okay.
It'll
then
still
yes.
be included in the CIP that goes to the city council.
Fair, okay, then yes.
So you
and
said-
I should also mention that Mr. Beagle did leave, so I'm not going to be calling him in the vote.
Okay.
So,
Yes.
ready for the vote?
Yep.
Okay, Mr. White,
Approved, yes, aye.
All right.
Mr. Polachek,
Aye.
Ms. Schmager,
Aye.
Mr. Picard.
Aye.
Motion passes 4-0.
All right. That was our big item on the agenda. Next is 7, recommendations for future agendas.
It won't be on the Public Works Board agenda. I could have brought it up under Director's Report, but I will be putting forward a name on Tuesday the 15th to the City Council for appointment of a Public Works Director.
All right. Anything else?
No, I think the same subjects that we had
Right.
mentioned the last meeting, and also just a College Street status update would be interesting if everything's going as planned. Be helpful.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. All right. If nothing else for,
For the next meeting?
Oh, unless you wanted to give one now. I mean, that should have been perhaps in the question on the director's report.
Probably an item we could have put on there. So currently, the construction is still in the utility phase. I believe they started stormwater construction this morning. I believe that most of the sewer is installed. They are looking to do storm sewer and water, and then the services for both utilities in the coming weeks, as originally planned. TJ and I met this morning with the contractor as far as trying to coordinate with the electrics contractor, MP Systems. They're looking to come in next week, in the next 2 to 3 weeks, to work on the electric and coordinate with the contractor that is doing the street work. And so as far as, I guess, summary, it's on schedule and moving forward.
Good.
if that helps, we can
Yeah, thanks.
provide another update next month.
Thank you.
All right. All right, if nothing else, then on that, we'll move on to item 8, which is adjournment, and I will declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.